Medieval society had some twisted ways of dealing with fat people that's darker than you'd imagine, and the shocking double standard will leave you speechless. Picture a time when having a belly meant you had made it in life. Medieval Europe was a place where your waistline told everyone exactly where you stood on the social ladder. Most ordinary folks back then, skinny as rails. Not by choice, mind you. They spent their days hauling grain, plowing fields, and doing back-breaking labor that would make modern gym rats weep. Their dinner was usually bread, porridge, and maybe some vegetables if they were lucky. Meat was for special occasions like when someone got married or died. But climb up that social ladder and things got interesting fast. Nobles had access to the good stuff. We're talking roasted pork, honey cakes, wine that flowed like water, and enough butter to sink a ship. When you can afford to eat like a king, well, you start looking like one too, and by looking like one, I mean round. The medieval chronicles are absolutely packed with descriptions of hefty rulers and clergy, kings with bellies that preceded them into rooms, monks whose robes strained at the seams, wealthy merchants who needed help getting on their horses. These weren't just casual observations either. Medieval writers seemed oddly fascinated by documenting who had gotten fat and how fat they'd gotten. Here's what's wild, though. Back then, being heavy wasn't just about having money for food. It was a walking advertisement that you didn't have to work with your hands. While peasants were burning calories from dawn to dusk, nobles could lounge around, feast, and let others do the heavy lifting. The contrast was stark. A skinny noble was almost suspicious. What was wrong? Were they sick? Poor? Had they fallen from grace? Meanwhile, a fat peasant was practically impossible. Where would they get the calories? This whole system created some pretty amusing situations. Imagine being so wealthy that your biggest problem was fitting through doorways, while everyone else worried about having enough to eat tomorrow. Talk about first world problems, medieval edition. Medieval storytellers loved describing these contrasts. They'd write about kings whose armor had to be specially made, or bishops who needed 2 horses, or lords who couldn't climb stairs without stopping to catch their breath. Body size back then was like wearing a uniform that announced your social class to everyone you met. Rich meant round, poor meant lean. Simple as that. But here's where things get really interesting. While society accepted fatness as a sign of success, the church had some very different ideas about what all that eating meant for your soul. The medieval church had a lot to say about fat people, and trust me, none of it was particularly flattering. Gluttony wasn't just frowned upon, it made the official list of 7 deadly sins, right up there with pride, greed, and wrath. Talk about bad company. Church leaders preached that overeating revealed a weak soul. They believed your spiritual health showed up in your waistline. Monks spent countless hours warning each other about the dangers of sinful eating, probably while eyeing the monastery's bread supplies with suspicion. But here's where it gets interesting. The church's obsession with gluttony wasn't really about health. It was about control. They taught that indulging your appetite meant you couldn't control your desires, and if you couldn't resist an extra helping of stew, how could you resist other temptations? Medieval moral tales loved linking fatness to spiritual failure. Fat characters in stories were almost always portrayed as lazy, greedy, or corrupt. These weren't subtle hints either. Writers basically hit readers over the head with the message that big bellies equaled bad souls. Then there's the flip side. Fasting became the ultimate spiritual flex. Skinny monks were practically celebrities. The thinner you got through religious discipline, the holier everyone assumed you were. Some saints were famous specifically for how little they ate. Makes you wonder what they'd think of modern diet culture. The weird part? Many of the clergy preaching against gluttony were themselves quite well fed. Monastery kitchens weren't exactly known for serving tiny portions. High-ranking church officials often lived better than most nobles. They had access to fine wines, rich foods, and multiple daily meals while telling everyone else to practice restraint. Medieval confession manuals included detailed questions about eating habits. Priests were supposed to ask parishioners about overeating, eating too fancy foods, or enjoying meals too much. Apparently, even smiling while eating your dinner could be spiritually suspicious. The church also promoted specific fasting days throughout the year. Wednesdays, Fridays, and the entire season of Lent meant restricted eating for everyone. These weren't gentle suggestions. Breaking fasting rules could lead to serious punishment. Religious art from the period shows this obsession clearly. Paintings depicted gluttony as a disgusting vice, often represented by grotesquely fat figures surrounded by food. Meanwhile, holy figures appeared thin and ethereal, almost floating above earthly concerns like hunger. But the church's influence went beyond just spiritual matters. Their teaching shaped how society viewed larger people for centuries. When religious authorities declared fatness sinful, it affected everything from marriage prospects to business relationships. Of course, medieval medicine had its own fascinating theories about body size and what caused it. Medieval doctors weren't exactly working with the latest medical journals. They relied heavily on ancient Greek and Roman texts, treating them like sacred scripture. Galen's theories from the 2nd century, still the gold standard 1,000 years later. Talk about job security for dead guys. These physicians saw the human body as a delicate balance of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Being a bit chunky wasn't necessarily bad news. Actually, it often meant you had enough resources to eat well, which many considered a sign of good health. The real concern kicked in when someone became what they called morbidly corpulent. Now here's where it gets interesting. Medieval medical texts warned that extreme fatness could genuinely shorten your lifespan. They weren't wrong about that part, but their solutions? Well, let's just say modern doctors might raise an eyebrow or two. The standard prescription started reasonably enough. Special diets, usually involving less meat and more vegetables. Exercise was recommended, though telling a wealthy noble to go for a jog wasn't always well received. Herbal remedies were popular too. Everything from fennel to help digestion to various concoctions that promised to burn away excess flesh. But then things got weird. Some physicians prescribed emetics to make patients vomit regularly. Others pushed laxatives as a weight loss strategy. Imagine explaining that treatment plan to your insurance company today. The theory behind these harsh methods tied back to those 4 humors. Doctors believed that excessive weight came from an imbalance, usually too much hot and moist humor. They thought purging would restore equilibrium. Makes sense, right? Actually, no, it really doesn't. Medieval physicians also had some creative ideas about fat distribution. They believed different types of obesity required different treatments. Someone who was soft and flabby needed different herbs than someone who was firm and round. They were surprisingly observant about body types, even if their explanations were completely off base. The wealthy could afford these medical interventions, questionable as they were. Poor folks dealing with weight issues, which was rare anyway, had to rely on folk remedies or just tough it out. What's fascinating is how these early doctors recognized obesity as a legitimate medical concern, not just a moral failing. They saw it as something requiring professional treatment, even if their methods were bizarre by today's standards. Then there's the social aspect that made everything more complicated, because when you're dealing with medieval medicine, personal image and public perception always entered the equation, creating a whole different set of pressures and expectations that went far beyond simple health concerns. Medieval society had a funny way of judging bodies, and it all came down to who you were and what you did for a living. Peasants actually valued being thin because it showed you weren't lazy. If you looked lean and muscular, everyone knew you worked hard in the fields from dawn to dusk. Makes sense, right? But here's where things get interesting. Nobles could actually lose respect for getting too fat. Unlike what you might expect, being a chunky lord wasn't always seen as impressive. People would whisper behind your back, calling you soft and useless. Some nobles got roasted so hard in songs and stories that their reputations never recovered. Medieval entertainers loved making fun of fat rulers. Traveling musicians would sing jokes about bloated kings who couldn't fit on their horses. Court jesters cracked jokes about nobles who needed 2 servants just to stand up. Even serious chronicles sometimes included snarky comments about a ruler's expanding waistline. The medieval equivalent of late-night comedy shows, basically. Then there's the legendary King Sancho of Leon, who became so massive that his own nobles kicked him off the throne. They literally called him Sancho the Fat and decided he was too heavy to rule effectively. Imagine explaining that to your kids. Sorry, children, Daddy lost his kingdom because he couldn't stop eating. The guy had to go on a medieval diet plan just to win back his crown. This wasn't just about appearances either. Medieval people genuinely believed that fat rulers made bad decisions. They thought excess weight made you lazy, slow-thinking, and morally weak. A king who couldn't control his appetite probably couldn't control a kingdom. Pretty harsh logic, but it stuck around for centuries. The social pressure was real. Nobles who gained too much weight faced constant mockery at court. Other lords would make jokes during feasts, servants would gossip in the kitchens, and even visiting dignitaries might comment on a ruler's size. Your political enemies could use your weight against you in very public ways. Well, the irony here is thick. The same wealth that allowed nobles to eat rich foods also made them targets for ridicule. Having access to meat, wine, and sweets was a privilege, but gaining too much weight from these luxuries could cost you respect and power. But what about the practical side of being heavy in medieval times? The daily struggles went far beyond social embarrassment, and some of these challenges were downright uncomfortable. Being heavy in medieval times wasn't just about dealing with judgmental priests or nosy doctors. The real nightmare was trying to navigate everyday life when everything around you was built for smaller people. Doorways back then were narrow, really narrow. We're talking about stone archways designed when most folks barely scraped 5 feet tall and weighed as much as a modern teenager. If you were a portly noble trying to squeeze through your own castle entrance, well, that's when things got awkward fast. Chairs were another daily torment. Medieval furniture wasn't exactly built for comfort to begin with, but add some extra pounds and you're looking at a comedy show nobody wanted to watch. Wooden chairs would creak ominously. Stone benches offered no mercy. And don't even get me started on trying to mount a horse when you've been enjoying too many royal feasts. Then there's the clothing situation. Lucky for wealthy folks, they could afford custom tailoring. Armor had to be specially crafted for larger nights, which cost a fortune and took months. Poor people, they just had to make do with whatever fabric they could stretch around themselves. But here's where it gets interesting. Public reaction wasn't quite what you'd expect. Sure, people noticed when someone was unusually large, but outright bullying wasn't the norm. Medieval folks had bigger problems to worry about, like plague, famine, and whether their lord would tax them into starvation. However, festivals were a different story entirely. During certain celebrations, communities would put on shows mocking gluttony and excess eating. Fat characters became stock figures in these performances, usually representing the sins of the wealthy, while the audience, mostly poor and thin themselves, got to laugh at their betters. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. Manual laborers, who made up most of the population, physically couldn't become fat even if they wanted to. They burned every calorie they consumed, just surviving their brutal daily routines. Obesity was literally a rich person's problem, which made it both envied and resented. Privacy was nearly impossible too. Medieval life happened in public spaces. Your eating habits, your struggles with mobility, your need for special accommodations, everyone saw everything. Gossip traveled faster than news of war, and being the talk of the village wasn't always pleasant. The practical challenges were endless, from fitting through market stalls to finding clothes that didn't split at the seams. But medieval society's relationship with body size went far deeper than just practical concerns, especially when it came to questions of beauty, gender, and the completely different standards applied to men versus women. King Sancho I of Leon earned himself quite the unfortunate nickname. They called him Sancho the Fat. And trust me, this wasn't some gentle ribbing from his buddies. The guy got so massive that his own nobles basically said, "Listen, we can't have a king who needs a crane to get on his horse." They kicked him off the throne in 958. Imagine losing your entire kingdom because you couldn't stop reaching for the medieval equivalent of donuts. But here's where it gets interesting. Sancho didn't just accept his fate and start a food blog. He traveled all the way to Cordoba to see Hasdai ibn Shaprut, one of the most famous doctors of his time. This physician was like the medieval equivalent of those celebrity doctors, except he actually knew what he was doing. The treatment? Well, let's just say it wasn't gentle. Ibn Shaprut basically locked Sancho in a room and put him on what we'd call an extreme diet today. Some accounts suggest they literally sewed his lips partially shut to control his eating. Makes those modern diet pills look pretty tame, doesn't it? Then there's the case of certain abbots and bishops who preached about the sin of gluttony while secretly struggling with their own expanding waistlines. One chronicle mentions an abbot who required special reinforcement for his chair during church services. The irony was thicker than his belt. Medieval doctors got creative with their cures. They prescribed everything from sleeping for extended periods to vigorous massages meant to literally squeeze the fat out of people. Some physicians recommended a diet of nothing but herbs and water for months. Others suggested patients be rolled down hills or shaken vigorously after meals. Court records from various kingdoms show desperate attempts to help extremely obese nobles. One French count reportedly hired servants whose only job was to follow him around and physically prevent him from eating between meals. Another noble had his kitchen staff replaced entirely because he suspected they were sneaking him extra food. The most extreme case involved a German lord who became so large that his castle had to be modified. They widened doorways, reinforced floors, and built custom furniture. When he died, they had to remove part of a wall to get his body out for burial. These weren't just medical curiosities, they were real people dealing with serious problems using the limited knowledge of their time. Speaking of real people, though, the medieval approach to obesity wasn't the same for everyone. Men and women faced completely different expectations and judgments about their bodies. Medieval beauty standards were about as confusing as trying to assemble furniture without instructions. What looked good on a woman versus a man? Well, that depended on who you were, where you lived, and frankly, what year it was. For noble women, having some meat on your bones wasn't always a bad thing. A little plumpness could signal fertility and health. Makes sense, right? If you're skinny as a rake, people might wonder if you're sick or too poor to eat properly. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't about being genuinely fat. We're talking about gentle curves, not rolling hills. The wealthy ladies had access to rich foods, but they also had to maintain a delicate balance. Too thin and you looked poor. Too heavy and you risked being seen as gluttonous, which brought its own problems. Medieval poets sometimes praised fuller figures in their verses, describing women with rounded arms and soft faces as beautiful. But they weren't exactly writing love songs about truly obese women. Then there's the men. Oh boy, did they get the short end of the stick. A fat nobleman was prime target for mockery. His weight suggested laziness, overindulgence, and weakness. People would whisper about how he couldn't control his appetites, and if he couldn't manage his dinner, how could he manage his lands? But here's the kicker. Poor women rarely faced these beauty dilemmas because they simply couldn't get fat. Hard manual labor and limited food supply kept most peasant women lean whether they wanted to be or not. The whole beauty debate was essentially a rich person's problem. Medieval literature reveals some fascinating contradictions too. Some stories celebrate voluptuous heroines, while others mock heavy characters mercilessly. Court records show that female obesity was treated more as a medical curiosity than a moral failing. Unlike their male counterparts who faced serious political consequences, the double standard was crystal clear. A plump merchant's wife might be seen as well-fed and prosperous. A plump merchant. He was probably considered greedy and unreliable. Women had more wiggle room in the weight department, but only within very specific limits. And the weird part is how quickly these attitudes could shift. What seemed attractive in one decade might be scorned in the next. Fashion changed, political climate shifted, and suddenly everyone's talking about different body ideals. But beyond all these social expectations and beauty standards, something far more dramatic was happening behind castle walls. The extreme cases, the ones that pushed medieval medicine to its absolute limits. But here's where things get really twisted. Medieval society didn't just judge fat people and move on. They created an entire entertainment industry around mocking them. Picture the town square on market day. Jesters would waddle around with fake bellies, pretending to be gluttonous nobles. The crowd would roar with laughter as these performers struggled to walk or pretended to get stuck in doorways. Makes you wonder if medieval comedy clubs were just as brutal as modern ones, right? Then there were the mystery plays. These religious dramas often featured gluttony as an actual character, usually a bloated figure who stumbled around stage, eating everything in sight before meeting some terrible fate. Kids would point and laugh while their parents nodded approvingly at the moral lesson. Well, the really sick part was feast day celebrations. Some towns held contests to see who could eat the most, then publicly shamed the winners. Talk about mixed messages. They'd encourage gluttony, then mock it immediately after. Medieval people really knew how to mess with someone's head. But the cruelest spectacle? Public penance for the obese clergy. When a monk or priest grew too fat, church authorities sometimes forced them to confess their sin of gluttony in front of the entire congregation. These men had to stand there while hundreds of people stared at their bodies and listened to their shame. And the weird part is how they justified this cruelty. Medieval folks genuinely believed that public mockery served God's purpose. They thought humiliation would cure fat people of their supposed moral failing, like medieval fat camp, but with more psychological torture. Street performers made decent money with fat jokes, too. Traveling minstrels carried songs about corpulent kings from town to town. One popular tune described a ruler so heavy that his horse begged for mercy. Another told of a nobleman whose belly arrived at dinner parties 3 minutes before he did. Let's not forget the seasonal festivals. During Carnival, people wore exaggerated fat suits and paraded through streets, gorging themselves dramatically before the fasting period of Lent began. It was like Halloween, but specifically designed to mock body size. The most disturbing aspect? Children learned to participate early. Parents encouraged kids to laugh at heavy adults, teaching them that certain body types deserved ridicule. Medieval bullying wasn't just tolerated, it was systematically passed down through generations. This entertainment culture reveals something darker about medieval attitudes toward obesity. It wasn't enough to simply disapprove. They needed to actively humiliate anyone who dared to be different.